Yeah, quite a bit. Oh, I shoot. Is it 7?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to start. Yeah, well, welcome everyone to Evening at Egan. This is UAS's annual fall lecture series. So my name is Kitty LaBounty, and I am a biology professor over at the Sitka campus. And for the last 14 years, I've hosted the Sitka campus's Natural History Seminar Series. And this year, I'm really happy to be able to collaborate with the Evenings at Egan so that we can have seminars. And the other benefit for me is I get to include a few speakers that I would have hosted actually in Sitka. And the first of those speakers is Derek Sikes tonight. He's a professor of entomology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and curator of insects at the Museum of the North. And since his arrival in 2006, Derek has really fostered a significant increase in knowledge of Alaska's microfauna. Through research and education at both the university and the community level, and through a lot of interesting public outreach, including more recently this little effort on Facebook that's been kind of fun. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Derek Sikes. And I just wanted to mention before I totally give up the microphone that you can type your questions in the chat window and we'll monitor them and then get to those at the end. So yes, thanks everyone, and take it away, Derek.
Thanks, Kitty, and thanks everyone for coming. I hope you're all ready to learn about insects in Alaska and their potential impacts due to climate change. This is a little bit of an unusual talk in that I'm going to be spending about 2/3 of the talk reviewing sort of introductory and material and publications and science that I wasn't directly involved with, and so it's the work that I've been involved with will be a little near the end, but it's a topic of great interest with many permutations and consequences for all of us. So I'll begin with standard sort of acknowledgements of funding agencies, very important funding agencies for the work that I've done, and my research associates, including my family in the lower left there. You can see, hopefully you can see with the mouse. And a lot of lab technicians and volunteers and students and undergraduates, a lot of great people doing this kind of work. Really requires a huge team, and I've been blessed to have a number of excellent collaborators and assistants and students helping me out. So as I mentioned, about the first two of these sort of three main sections, we're going to begin with sort of general insect information, their importance in ecosystems. Sometimes people think of them as merely a nuisance, and wouldn't it be better if they all disappeared? And I'll hopefully convince you otherwise. And some work that's coming out about you may have heard the term insect apocalypse, and this is a topic I'll focus on in the middle of the talk, and then near the end, we're going to talk about climate change impacts on insects and other invertebrates in Alaska specifically. So as you all are probably well aware, insects play a number of really important ecosystem service roles. Pollinators jumps out at the top of the list that most people are familiar with, that if insects were to disappear, lots of plants would soon follow, including many plants we rely on for agriculture. They also play little appreciated roles in decomposition, so helping to recycle organic matter back into food webs. And a lot of them are predators that may feed upon insects that you might consider to be a nuisance. Garden pests, for example, may get eaten by yellow jacket or some other predator, ground beetle, for example. But we talk about the insects as being this like glue that holds ecosystems together, and a little like a glue, it's sort of like invisible to most people. If you go down to the rainforest, you're going to be confronted with an enormous amount of green vegetation, and it takes a while to and some effort to really understand how many insects are actually there. But research has been done in the rainforests, here cited by E.O. Wilson in '87, but based on a 1973 study. This was looking at 1 hectare of tropical rainforest, and of all the animal tissue in that rainforest, 93% of it was invertebrate, and about 1/3 of that were ants alone. So huge amount of biomass, far greater biomass in the rainforest than the birds and the mammals and the reptiles. But up in Alaska, so here we have, this is a creature called a springtail. It's a very sort of one of the more ancient body forms of insects. It evolved before wings, this group of insects, and they're ubiquitous in many ecosystems. Terrestrial ecosystems. So Stephen McLean, a researcher at Institute of Arctic Biology at UAF back in the '70s, did a lot of soil work and looking at all of the microarthropods and other organisms in the soil. And he estimated the biomass of mites, which are your, 8-legged arachnids, that the mites and the springtails alone in 1 square mile equaled the weight of 43 moose. That's 34,000 pounds under your feet as you're walking through the boreal forest. So incredible biomass, we don't see it. The reproductive capacity of insects is enormous. You probably heard of, K-selected versus R-selected organisms, those that have a lot of sort of a smaller clutch size and parental care versus those that are spawners. Well, most insects are spawners in the sense that they have enormous reproductive output. And this calculation puts that, it makes it quite clear. 1 fly, like this particular sarcophagid from Indonesia I photographed, if all her progeny survived and bred, the eggs laid on April 15th with several hundred per batch, 20 batches, 10-day life cycle. By September, there would be 5.6 trillion offspring from that 1 fly. And this would cover Germany to a depth of 47 feet. Now, that doesn't happen. Obviously, why aren't we buried in flies, right? What's the explanation for this? You probably would guess that the most obvious explanation is that they don't all survive. All those insects being generated, the majority of them end up as food for some other creature. And looking at spiders, which some people have an aversion to. This is a beautiful orb weaver I photographed, actually in my living room. But in some areas, spiders catch and eat a mass of insects annually of greater weight than the humans of the area. This is work that came out of England initially in 1958, but it was updated in the year 2000. And so I used those calculations for spider kill rates of insects for Alaska and calculated up that the spiders in Alaska kill probably a minimum of about 300 million pounds of insects annually, which is greater than the weight of all the moose in Alaska. At the high end, they could be as high as 13.6 billion pounds of insects being killed. There's a fair bit of uncertainty in how many pounds of insects are killed by spiders, but they play a very important role in the ecosystem. If we lost the spiders, the number of mosquitoes would be at a bothersomely high level, as if they're not bothersome enough already. So, of course, birds, fish, mammals, lots of vertebrates eat insects. And just here's a classic example. Chickadees and other aerial insectivores are gleaning insects off vegetation, or they're catching them on the wing. A pair of chickadees can feed their young hundreds of caterpillars per day, requiring over 6,000 caterpillars to make 1 clutch of chickadees. So if you're, I sometimes think about people who spray insecticides in their yard to get rid of mosquitoes. They're those insecticides are killing a lot more than mosquitoes. They're killing pretty much all the insects that are in the yard, probably a lot of things in the soil too. So you're really altering the ecosystem if you're trying to get rid of mosquitoes with insecticides. The birds are not going to have any food in your yard, for example. So the best way to get rid of mosquitoes in your yard is probably with one of those mosquito magnet traps. I mean, there's a few other ideas out there, but these mosquito magnet traps actually pull, draw mosquitoes in using carbon dioxide as an attractant, and kill pretty much only mosquitoes. You get a few other things in there, but you don't end up with this mass slaughter of biodiversity. Species richness, insects are, and everyone should be aware of this, but here we have a pie chart showing animal diversity on Earth, and these are just the described species. But of the described animals, 80% are arthropods. So those are your insects, your spiders, your centipedes, millipedes, your crabs, lobsters, sow bugs, things like that, mites, ticks, all of that. The majority of animals have their skeleton on the outside of their body. The animals that have their skeleton on the inside of their body fall into this small category here of deuterostomes, along with some starfish and a few other invertebrate groups. So having a skeleton on the inside of the body is a pretty strange way for an animal to be built. Now, we, of course, have our skeletons on the inside of our body, and so we think it's normal, but it's technically quite unusual. So here we have some animals with skeletons on the inside of their body. I, of course, was very excited to see these when I first moved to Alaska, but I was most excited to see this enormous diversity. You don't have to go to a national park to see thousands, well, potentially thousands of species in your backyard. And I was just a kid in a candy shop seeing all kinds of things I'd never seen before when I moved to Alaska. And we have here a variety of arthropods. So we've got two arachnids up here. We've got a true spider and a non-spider over here in the right corner. So this is actually a non-native species from Europe. This is a harvestman that, contrary to popular myth, has no venom. So this has no venom at all, and it's not a spider. It has no silk. It has only one body part instead of two. There's a lot of differences between these things. But I could go on about all these different things, but we have a lot to talk about. So I'm not gonna focus on any one, other than perhaps to mention in the far right corner, we do have a non-native butterfly that has taken up residence in interior Alaska, the Compton tortoiseshell. And so this is a possible climate change tie-in. We don't really know for sure, but in 2002, these butterflies established in interior Alaska, and or at least were first documented. We don't know if they established a little bit earlier, but they've been breeding successfully ever since and spreading throughout the interior. Classic, potential, part of one of the expectations of climate change is the fauna will change. It'll be warmer and more conducive to species from lower latitudes to move northward. So I'm going to show a lot of graphs in this talk, but I also want to make sure I threw in some really cool insects. And here's one of my favorites. This is, I love to show this to undergraduates in entomology and ask them what it is. And even if they're taking entomology, they usually say, oh, it's a bumblebee. But if you look closely, you'll see this is the head of a fly. And in fact, this is mimicking a bumblebee. And of course, the fact that it has only one pair of wings instead of two is another giveaway. But this is a caribou botfly. So this is one of these flies that lays its eggs in caribou, and the larvae develop, and they're a bit of a nuisance to the caribou. But they're a really interesting connection between the insect world, the caribou world, and also grizzlies, because where I found this in Denali National Park, a grizzly had ripped up the tundra and exposed a big dirt patch. And that's where these flies go to find mates. They look for these kind of unusual patches of bare ground. So here's a few other beautiful insects. We have a parent bug, a queen yellow jacket that had overwintered. So this was in the year 2007, right after we had a huge outbreak in 2006 that I'll talk about later. We have a lady beetle and these yellow droplets that you see here, 3 on each side. Probably very few of you know what these are, but I'll tell you, this is a defensive reaction. Lady beetles will reflexively bleed as a defense. And the blood is laden with nasty tasting chemicals. And how do I know they're nasty? Because I've actually tasted them. And you don't want to do that twice. Then, you know, if some creature, some predator tastes that, presumably they will remember to leave lady beetles alone after that. Here we have one of our more metallic beetles in Alaska. We don't have a lot of really gorgeous metallic beetles like in the tropics, but this is the resplendent click beetle. And another beautiful eye catcher. This is not just a gorgeous beetle, what is commonly referred to as the rainbow beetle, very eye-catching. But this has got an interesting biogeographic story in that it is wingless, and the whole genus that it belongs to is wingless. And it is widely distributed in Asia, all the way to Europe. And it's found in interior Alaska, but it's not yet found up in the Arctic as far as we know, and not yet found south of the Alaska range as far as we know, but it has moved into the Yukon. So if you're at all familiar with the Beringian past, where we had land bridge connections with Asia, that this beetle presumably walked across that land bridge and colonized interior Alaska, but it's the only place in North America that you can find the species. So it's a really interesting Beringian story. And here we have another Beringian species in the family I specialize on, the Sylphidae. But this is an unusual one in that it's a plant-feeding sylphid. Most sylphids are carrion feeding on rotten meat. So that's just a little introduction to insects, their importance, and I guess showing you those gorgeous creatures like this one, for example. I wanted to add that it's not just the ecosystem services and the biomass, the fact that they pollinate and are food for other animals, but that they are beautiful and and really rewarding to observe and study in their own right. And thus provide a lot of connection with nature for people who spend the time looking closely at them. So let's move on to the question, are we in an insect apocalypse? And talk a little bit about climate change. So climate change, and I'll preface this also that I'm certainly not a climate scientist. I'm just reviewing some of the literature most relevant to some of the sort of the questions that I've received from the public or statements that I've heard. So one of the statements that I've heard is we're still coming out of the last ice age. That, you know, the reason that the world is getting warmer is because we're still coming out of the last ice age. Now that's not actually true. Temperatures peaked 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. So here you see the years on the x-axis going back 10,000 years. And here we have coming out of the last ice age. That's when we were coming out of the last ice age. This is an interglacial period where human agriculture was developed, and we were actually cooling off until we get to the modern era when, you know, climate change has kicked in. Now let's look at a few more graphs. This one addresses the question of, some people say temperature can change dozens of degrees on a daily basis. Why worry about 2 degrees of warming? You know, the 2 degrees that we're hoping to keep the global averages under. Well, that's a confusion of climate and weather. And so it's a little tricky to explain in that, of course, we're dealing with an average, right? And the weather is not the average, it's the climate is the average. This graph, which here's that same, coming out of the last ice age, this graph and this section of this graph is all of human history for modern agriculture. So this goes back to about 10,000 years. And the temperature in here for agricultural history between these two arrows is less, this is the average global temperature, is less than 1 degree C. So for all of human agriculture, the average has been within that range of plus or minus less than 1 degree C. And so the idea of 2 degrees warming, that is this section here. So if we go up 2 degrees, then here's the 2 degrees over there. These are temperatures that are unknown to humans. We've never lived in a world, at least modern agriculture has not existed in a world that has been this warm. So we're hoping to keep it below the 2 degrees, but if we fail, then we end up in this red area here. Now, what would happen if we ended up there? Well, this just came out. I saw it just the other day. I think this is just published. This is pushing that signal back 67 million years. And people say, oh, the climate has changed before. Well, yes, it has changed. There, back in 50 million years ago, when we had the hottest temperatures in the Eocene, we had palm trees and crocodiles in near the North Pole, and there were no ice caps. I mean, there was no ice or glaciers of any kind. So this is a very different world. Now, moving here, here's 20,000 years before present, here's 10,000 years. So there's where we came out of the last ice age. And here we are right in this nice area where the temperatures are relatively cool and what we're used to. If business as usual continues and greenhouse gases accumulate as fast as they have been, we could theoretically, by the year 2300, so 2300, we could end up with temperatures that are like it used to be in the Eocene, with crocodiles happily swimming around in the Arctic. That is a world that would be so dramatically different. It's just hard to imagine. Now, one other point I'd like to make. I've heard variations on these statements, but what if these scientists are conspiring to conceal the truth from the public? Or maybe more benignly, people might think, but what if science has yet to find the real cause of the warming? What if it's not, human-caused greenhouse gases? I think these statements both show a bit of a misunderstanding of how science works, because science is incredibly competitive. Scientists win by finding results that no one can refute. If any scientist could find results that showed that this was not human-caused warming, and no one else could refute those results, they would become legendary. They would become famous. So scientists are competing with one another to find the truth. And once you have found the truth, presumably no one else can change your results because the truth doesn't change, right? All the major discoveries in science that refuted past falsehoods that revolutionized our understanding of nature, like heliocentrism, germ theory, plate tectonics, evolution, etc. Those scientists became legendary. They overturned all prior thought, misunderstandings by finding something that no one else could refute. And they thus went down in history forever. So this is how science works. And if all these scientists, thousands of our brightest minds, have come to the wrong conclusion about climate change, I and everyone else would be shocked if someone could come up with a different answer that was actually true. So let's focus on insects with climate change. So here's a physiological study that looked at ectotherms. So, what you might call cold-blooded organisms, but they, they don't generally they don't generate their own internal body heat, and or it changes, dependent on external temperatures in many ways. So we talk about winners and losers with climate change. And so this study looked at fitness changes, predicted fitness changes for species based on latitude. So we have latitude on the x-axis with the equator right here in the middle, the southern on the left and the northern 60 degrees on the right. And so the winners would be these southerly species and these northernly species, like up in Alaska, that are predicted based on this fairly simple modeling to have a benefit from increased warming. The losers are going to be these species that are down near the equator, which is a little counterintuitive. We think of the north as being so cold, and so if you add a lot of heat, isn't that going to be bad? And since the equator is so warm, aren't those species used to warmth already? So that's sort of counterintuitive. Well, think about the answer is that near the equator, these species are not used to wide seasonal fluctuations. They may be used to warmth, but they're used to a very narrow band of temperature. And if that temperature heats up, they have got to move up to higher elevation or higher latitude to track that, because they're just not used to wide swings of temperature at all. Evolution can, kick in, but evolution works relatively slowly, and the climate change we're seeing is enormously fast. So it's a great concern. Now, here's an example of a species that might benefit, a more northern latitude species that might benefit from additional warming. This was a niche modeling study from 2003 looking at the gypsy moth near Salt Lake City. And in the historic data set, 1950 to 1980, about 12% of the aspen area was at risk. The red area here was at risk of gypsy moth. But in a warmer world, 2070 to 2100, the modeling predicts that almost 99% of that area will be at risk of gypsy moth. So gypsy moth will be a winner in the sense that it will benefit it and increase fitness, increase population size, and as a defoliator of our forests, it could very well lead to more problems with our forests. Now, the insect apocalypse is here. This was a article in the New York Times magazine in 2018, because the number of studies had come out, scientific studies had come out on insect declines. And mentioned in a lot of these, and there was a lot of news coverage of various sorts, is this thing called the windshield phenomenon, which is this, you may have even experienced this yourself, the idea that you recall many years ago, perhaps having to constantly clean off your windshield, all the dead bugs, and now you don't have to do it as much anymore. I mean, this is a story that people say. It's not very scientific, it's anecdote. Maybe cars are more aerodynamic now. There's a lot of possible explanations. This is a funny New Yorker cartoon that my former friend Ken Phillip really liked. Just so you know, you've got a lot of really rare specimens preserved here. Yeah, so back when they had full service gas stations. Okay, so here are some of the studies that led to that dramatic conclusion. This was one of the biggest, most well-cited ones out of Germany. 27 years of data. This German entomology group had just been running this trap system in the same way and measuring what normally entomologists do is they prepare collections and they identify all their specimens. What these guys did before they did that is they weighed the trap catch. They were like, let's just weigh the trap catch. 27 years ago, why did they start doing this? They didn't. They just thought it would be a good idea. And so these kind of data sets are rare, I guess is where I was going with that, is not very many people think it's a good idea to do the same thing for 27 years straight without any like funding or obvious goal in mind. But these guys did, and the result was pretty dramatic. So in Germany, they had these traps called malaise traps, which work a little like if you've ever gone camping and left your tent open by mistake and come back and found like a whole bunch of flies in your tent. That's how these traps work. The traps were all placed in areas that were meant to preserve ecosystem function and diversity. So they were these sort of natural areas that were preserved in between a lot of agriculture and development. And I asked the authors of this study about when were those agricultural fields put in, and they said, we think they were put in by the Romans. So these fields are pretty old. So this system has been in place for a long time. But here's what their results were. So this is biomass. So they're simply weighing their catch. And we have month of the year of the trap catch along the x-axis. I hear a little noise. Maybe someone needs to mute themselves. So the yellow show the more recent data, and the dark blue show the older data. So back at the beginning of the study in July, they had like even a high value of 20 grams of insects per day. But near the more recent sampling periods, they were getting as low as half a gram of insects per day. So 79% decline of biomass. And since insects are so important as food source and pollinators, et cetera, this was very worrisome. But that's Germany. Maybe it's a lot of agriculture, maybe who knows what the real cause is. They could not actually identify the cause. They looked at temperatures. They couldn't find anything that correlated as well as you'd want for a good explanatory answer. So this is a different research team who work long-term research up in Greenland. So these guys are in Denmark, and they were looking at muskid flies, which is a group of very important pollinators in the Arctic. And they found an 80% decline in the muskid flies over an 18-year period. So, this is not due to agriculture or pesticides. This is Greenland, where there's no agriculture at all near this field station. So here are their data. Wherever you see a line, there's significant difference from zero. The slope is significantly different from zero. And so we're seeing over that 18-year time period, significant declines across all three habitat types. This column is all muskids together, all the muskid flies together. This is the more common species. So they've kind of broken it out by species to see if there's species-specific signals. But you can see that in the arid and the wet fen, they had the most significant declines. In the mesic fen, not so much, but still very worrisome. They think this may have to do with drying of the habitat because the larva lives in the tundra and is exposed to the conditions down there. So very worrisome because those are a very important pollinator up in the Arctic. Now, this is a more recent study from 2019. October of last year, and again out of Germany, but they compared grasslands and forests, and they looked at biomass, abundance, and species, and they found 67, 78, and 34% declines in those three categories in grasslands, and in forests only 41 and 36% declines, not in abundance, but still in biomass and species. So, and then here's their graphs. So just downward projecting lines between 2008, 2017. So rather worrisome results from various places. This was a recent study on bumblebees between North America and Europe. And they found site occupancy declined on average by 46% in North America and 17% in Europe relative to the baseline period. So bumblebees, and I was involved with another bumblebee study that used a lot of the data from the University of Alaska Museum, and that was published in 2015. And here's that publication. And what this used 110 years of data across North America and Europe, which is one of, I should reiterate, that's one of the real advantages of having natural history collections, big museums that can maintain specimens for a long time period. And the results were that bumblebees were disappearing in the southern part of their range, and but not moving, not tracking northward. We don't know why. So that was worrisome. This is a Canadian bird study using data between 1970 and 2010, and the most dramatic decline of bird species or bird abundance is aerial insectivores. Now, we don't know if that has to do with their overwintering grounds, because these are migrant birds as well, but it could very well be a problem. Now, it's not all gloom and doom. There's good news. This is a study that came out just last month. No net insect abundance and diversity declines across US long-term ecological research sites. So within the United States, there are these federally funded long-term ecological research sites, and a lot of these have insect data. So this research team looked at that data. Here are their results. Some increases, some decreases, but overall, nothing significant, no significant signal different from zero. So that's good news. And two of these are Alaskan. So we have Arctic data here, and we have the Bonanza Creek long-term ecological research site near Fairbanks right here. Now that Bonanza Creek site has bark beetle data, and here's a closer look at the bark beetle data. I was, Stephen Burr, when he was working for the Forest Service here in Fairbanks, showed this slide at one of our meetings, and so I asked him if I could show it in this talk, and he loaned it to me. And so you can see these bark beetles from 1975. And this is, again, it's hard to get these long-term data sets where people are doing the same kind of trapping method, the same methods year in and year out. And we see, some noise, but no evidence of real declines. And here we have a recent sort of spike in the spruce beetle up in Fairbanks, but that was just a blip because it went back down again. Kind of a mysterious blip. Now, data that I helped produce, this was an undergraduate in my class, Michael Apperson, who was looking for a project. And so I said, hey, we've got this, there's this guy I know, Gary Newman, who has been running a mosquito magnet trap at his house. From 2002 until 2018, he had almost every year, he saved the mosquitoes from the trap for almost every year, and he gave them all to the museum. So there's Michael drying them out. And then here, this bag is all mosquitoes from 1 year from that trap. Now, you may be unhappy to hear that there's no decline in mosquitoes in interior Alaska. There's a lot of noise in the data, but we are not seeing a decline. So. But maybe you're happy to hear there's no decline, because mosquitoes are certainly food for other things, and they do some pollinating as well. So the University of Alaska Museum, where I work, the Museum of the North, as we affectionately call it, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the projects I've been more intimately involved with. Here's our website and some of the great students who've worked in my lab and lab techs. And of course, a lot of you are probably very familiar with the fact that Alaska is not only the largest state, but we have the greatest evidence of climate change, with warming in the Arctic twice as much as in lower latitudes. Significant biogeographic complexity, as I already alluded to, and that interior Alaska was connected to Asia for quite a bit of time. So the collection that I manage in the museum started in the year 2000, and it has grown significantly since then. We have over 2 million specimens represented by 352,000 records in an online database. So we're sharing all that data open access with the public, representing over 3,700 species. So this is really going to be a really amazing data set as it matures and gets improved over time. It's also, our oldest specimens date back to the late 1800s. We have a couple butterflies from Greenland from 1890s. But the majority, so this is the y-axis is number of our specimens, or occurrence records in this case, and we have on the x-axis the year of collection. So the majority of the University of Alaska Museum insect collection was collected after the year 2000. So this means the DNA are pretty good in those specimens. Also, the georeferencing is really good. We have really precise latitude, longitude data for these things. This is the discovery curve for non-marine arthropod species in Alaska, using the oldest specimen or literature records we know of for that species. So we're looking for records, the oldest record for that, for a species in Alaska. And if we go back to the 1840s when the Russians were describing things from Alaska, it took us, here's the Harriman expedition right at the turn of the century, but it wasn't until 1943 that we broke 1,000 species known for Alaska. And as work progressed, we have been adding species over time, and we are currently sitting at 8,932 known species. But look at that curve. I mean, if you look at the similar discovery curve for birds of Alaska, one thing you would notice is that it would, it would start low, and then it would go up, and then it would plateau, because it's very rare to find birds in Alaska that people have never seen before in Alaska. So you might get one or two strays every now and again, but you certainly don't get 1,000 new records a year the way we have with the arthropods. So this trajectory means we are a long ways from hitting that plateau. The plateau means that you're kind of done with, or you're getting close to being done with the inventory work, and we aren't there yet. And yet we are in the middle of this climate crisis. So here we have Kitty, who introduced me, and Matt down from and when I visited in Sitka, I thought I'd just take a break from some of these graphs and show some of the people I've been working with in the field, and some of the nice field locations that I've had the pleasure to survey and do work. Here's down on the Kenai Peninsula. This is with Matt Bowser from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Dan Began and from UAA. And some others, and we were doing BioBlitz work down on the Kenai, and here we have some alpine work where we're doing rapid inventory in southeast Alaskan mountaintops, alpine sites, and Kitty was on that again. The Pribilofs, so here's St. Paul, I believe, flying into St. Paul, which used to be a high point on the Bering Land Bridge. The Aleutians, have been sampling throughout the Aleutians, these treeless, wonderful, strange, very low biodiversity places. Here we have St. Matthew Island, way out in the Bering Sea, with one of those Malays traps. And there's St. Matthew Island again, another photo. Oh, and there's another photo of St. Matthew Island with some folks who might know. And when we were doing survey work there, with the Fish and Wildlife Service supporting us on that. And here we have National Park Service supporting our inventory work in the Seward Peninsula, Bering Land Bridge, where one of my goals was to visit this snowfield, because there are organisms associated with snowfields. And so we did a long hike out to that snowfield, and one of the brave students who came with my grad student and I was Timmery Stenek of Shishmaref, and she found this little snow scorpion fly, and here's a close-up of it. This is a wingless insect in the genus Boreas, and in the order Mecoptera, a very ancient group of insects. And that was almost certain, what Timmery found was almost certainly an undescribed species. Here's the record for that. And since these things are wingless, the two red records are the closest described species. So there's some down from Wrangell St. Elias area and some in the Pribilofs. So this is undescribed. We also have an undescribed species in interior Alaska. And then there's Russian records over here. But that's it for Boreas, for this region. So I've got a new grad student who's going to be working on this group of insects and hopefully describing some new species as part of her thesis work. Going to Anatuvik Pass with the Park Service for BioBlitz work as well. So really got to see a good chunk of the state as part of all this, this research. So let's kind of wrap things up. I know we're running low on time here. I want to hit on a few of the changes that we've seen or expecting to see in Alaska, particularly non-native species are a concern, particularly if they're invasive or pestiferous. And we do have 6 native species of ticks that live on our wildlife, but what we're worried about are the non-native species. And there's already one established, the American dog tick, and there's 2 non-native species that might be establishing. So this is work done in cooperation with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Kimberly Beckman is leading this project of getting citizens to turn in ticks they find on dogs and cats. And also, if you travel out of state with your pets, be very careful about using tick collars or other preventative measures to prevent ticks from other states getting into Alaska. We're very worried about these, that, you know, is one of the things most Alaskans usually say is, we don't have any ticks. And well, we've always had some native ticks, but now we're beginning to have these pestiferous ones too, non-native ones. And what we're really worried about is the winter tick, the moose tick that gets on moose. And moose have a terrible time cleaning these things off. They don't do a good job of it. And so some moose have been found with over 90,000 ticks, and a calf with more than 40,000 ticks won't survive more than a month or so. So it's really a concern. So being vigilant for ticks is very important. Kitty mentioned at the beginning about Facebook groups. There are 2 important Facebook groups for Alaska, the Bugs and Plants of Alaska and the Spiders of Alaska, where citizens post pictures of things they found and learn about them. And that's one way that we can stay abreast of new species that are appearing in the state. So if you're interested in those groups, they're pretty easy to join. And I've been working on updating a list of non-native species for Alaska. The list is very short. There's a little over 100 species, and a lot of those aren't established yet. So it's remarkable how small that list is compared to places like Oregon, for example. We don't have any dangerous spiders in Alaska. Some people think the brown recluse lives everywhere that people live, but that's not true. You can see from this map that here's where the brown recluse lives. Brown recluse lives down there. However, there are several recluse bites diagnosed, or people know of somebody who's been supposedly bitten by a brown recluse. And there are even disreputable pest control companies operating in the state who will go to somebody's house and tell them that they have a brown recluse infestation, and then of course get paid to clean up the infestation. But there are no brown recluse that have ever been found in Alaska. The spiders just have not turned up. And we have over 43,000 spiders in the museum, and none of them are brown recluse. So it is something to know about. It's something to keep an eye out for. It's theoretically possible they could come up in shipping or something. We have seen black widows come up that way, but they haven't become established. But just so you are aware of that. Here's a species we're worried about getting into Alaska. This is the Culex tarsalis. It's a mosquito that it has been moving northward. There's records from the Yukon, and now there's 2 records from Delta Junction, Alaska, that the National Ecological Observatory have documented. And the problem with this mosquito is it transmits West Nile virus, Western equine encephalitis, St. Louis encephalitis. So far, those diseases have not been found in the northern records, but this is again a concern and something that we're being vigilant about. Earthworms, non-native earthworms are spreading. They're quite well established along the coastal regions of Alaska, but they're even beginning to be found in the interior. So there's 18 species along the coast, and we now have 10 species in the interior. And these non-native earthworms can they're called ecosystem engineers because they can speed up the decomposition of the leaf litter and really change the relationship between plants and their mycorrhizal fungi, and make it hard for native plants to survive. And you end up with an increased probability of non-native plants moving in. Anyway, this study here was one that I worked on with a high school student in town here, Megan, who was looking for a project. And so I had her do a bunch of worm surveys, and her report became the very first scientific publication on earthworms in interior Alaska. So we've documented, we now have a field guide to butterflies of Alaska, although it's currently out of print. I'm hoping to get it reprinted for next summer. But this was work by Ken Phillip, who we've been processing his collection, and we now have a beautiful website with his collection, sort of virtual. You can do a virtual tour of his collection. So if you go to this website later, you can check that out. He was a prolific collector of butterflies, and each row represents one of 34 different species that I graphed out here. But you can see when Ken started collecting. And some species are pretty rare, but the coverage is really great. Butterflies are the most well-documented insects in Alaska, spatially and temporally. Ken would like to point out that, we've been talking about possible extinctions and conservation problems. And so people sometimes worry about him killing all these butterflies for his collection. But he would point out that with all his collecting and all his volunteers helping him out, it's worked out to about 1 specimen per 1,000 square miles per year. So his total impact on butterflies has been negligible. This is in contrast to simple road mortality. In Illinois, a study was done looking at butterfly and moth mortality along roadways, and they estimated 20 million moths and butterflies were killed per week for the entire state of Illinois during the summers. So when you think about a collector building up a collection of a few thousands of individuals, it's really a very different impact on nature than just driving cars around. One of my grad students looked at 2 climate change questions using butterfly data from Ken's collection. So this is Catherine Daly's work, and the publication is in prep, so I'm not going to give you the details, but she looked at wing length changes and found wing length changes in 2 species of Arctic butterflies related to warming, getting smaller. The butterflies are getting smaller, and phenology changes, meaning sort of flight activity had changed. So she was looking at 15 species in interior Alaska, and I believe 13 of them showed significantly early flight patterns as you get closer to modern time. So let's see. Yeah, we're getting low on time here. Sorry, I might be going a little over, but this is Ed Berg's work down in the Kenai Peninsula looking at bark beetles, and the massive outbreak in the 90s that exhausted basically all the mature spruce on the Kenai Peninsula was when temperatures had gone above this threshold line. And we are here, and of course the prediction is temperatures are going to basically stay above this line, meaning that spruce are going to have a really hard time. There's a big outbreak in South Central right now. It's been going on for a few years. This is from Beck et al., and there's other studies of a similar nature, basically showing that spruce are declining in productivity throughout much of the boreal forest. And what we're seeing is basically the climate has shifted beyond the physiological optimum for spruce growth. So the anticipation is that spruce are eventually, between fire and insects, they're going to decline in number to a point where they're going to be fairly rare on the landscape eventually, if climate continues to change as it does. From a more kind of medical perspective, this was a study done in collaboration with an epidemiologist looking at sting reports. So we had 2 people who died from yellow jacket stings in Alaska in 2006 when we had an outbreak in Fairbanks. And So we looked at sting reports across the state, and the sting incidence between 1999 and 2001 versus 2004, 2006. A significant increase in sting reports in all of these regions except for in Kodiak. So this is just a snapshot. It'd be really nice to have a much larger data set for this. So I'm hoping to repeat that. I had a grad student looking at these beetles that live on snowfields. I'd already kind of mentioned the importance of snowfields for some insects, but he was doing taxonomic work on these beetles. And he described 2 new species. So, and then here we have a slide showing the shrubification problem, loss of alpine snowfields and shrubs moving upslope. And there we have a similar slide from California, where snow line is expected to rise by an average of 950 feet by century's end. And alpine snow patches being a nutrient source for not just birds, but a variety of insects that use snow patches. So these beetles, he was looking at 2 of the species that he described as new, including this giant one on the left, have not been collected since 1979 and 1984. So we're a little worried about those 2 species because they live in these high alpine snowfield habitats that are, and that one that hadn't been collected was known from only a single mountain. Similar to this one in California, which was found, described as new at the toe of a catastrophically melting glacier, which may not last long. So I know I've gone a little over, but hopefully there's time for questions. I want to just summarize. We've got a lot of examples of climate change impacts on invertebrates globally: rain shifts, losses, extinctions, biomass declines. We are getting, you know, some seem pretty serious declines. Other places like the North American study, the U.S. long-term ecological research study, was optimistic, showing a lack of declines, but maybe it's well, I'll just leave it at that. And then Alaska's fauna is becoming better known, but we lack a good pre-warming baseline for most taxa. We don't even have a complete inventory for the state, and yet things are changing rapidly. We're getting non-native species coming in. We're worried about threatened species and insect outbreaks, and et cetera. So I'm going to leave it there with this quote. With each generation, the amount of environmental degradation increases, but each generation takes that amount as the norm. So it's very hard to appreciate what our grandparents and great-grandparents, the biodiversity that they get to experience. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. I guess I need to go into the chat for that. And if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat.
I can share a couple, Derek, that were sent to me directly.
Okay.
One is, have spotted winged Drosophila been found in Alaska?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. And then the next one I have is that the black spruce that is at risk from the bark beetle, or all spruce in the area?
Right. So that's that study was looking just at white spruce, but I remember asking that question, and I think the answer was there's no reason to think black spruce would be responding differently than white. So it's probably all. It's just they only have the real data on the white spruce.
And let's see, I've got another one, sorry.
Oh, so there's one here about, are there any known significant predators to the tortoiseshell, the invasive butterfly? Right, so that butterfly is not, I wouldn't call it invasive, just call it non-native. And yeah, you know, I don't know, it's a good question about whether there might be some parasitoids in its more southern latitude that are not in Alaska. But you know, there are yellow jackets and dragonflies that might occasionally eat them. So there's, but I wouldn't call them significant. But I also wouldn't call that butterfly invasive in this sort of traditional sense of being kind of pestiferous and in outbreak mode. Is there a cure for the spruce bark beetle? Well, the outbreak on the Kenai Peninsula ended when all of the mature spruce had been killed. Um, so that's not probably the answer you're looking for, but they will disappear when their food runs out. And there are, however, Forest Service personnel who are working heavily on this problem, and they know a lot more about control measures, protective measures that could be taken to help if you have ornamental spruce or something that you really want to protect. There are ways to help minimize the damage from bark beetles, but I'm definitely not the expert on that topic. Have I had a chance to survey the Great Kobuk sand dunes? Yeah, so I've never been to those sand dunes, but I've sent my grad student there because I think I was on one of those alpine trips at the time, and they're really interesting. There's at least a tiger beetle up there that is the only place that tiger beetle is known in Alaska, and so it's kind of a what we would call an endemic subspecies tiger beetle up there. But I would love to get up there someday. Do the Phlaeopterus beetles require year-round snowfield? That's a good question, Matt. I don't know. I don't know how they overwinter necessarily, but they do. They are scavengers, and they depend heavily on the snowfields for a food source. There are some species of Phlaeopterus that occur at lower elevations near cool streams and creeks, etc. So not all the species are snowfield associated, but that's a good question. I don't think the answer is known. I wish I could share a photo of this butterfly I saw yesterday. It looked like a monarch. Yeah, it's hard to know. There's only one monarch that's ever been found in Alaska, and it was found dead in a cabin, and we had no idea how it got there. But there are some other butterflies like the red admiral, occasionally makes it up in eruptive flights, and there's a few others, but there's not a lot of butterflies known from Juneau, so it'd be really great to get a photo of those. Let's see. Okay. Why are insects steeply declining in certain Greenland habitats, wet, fen, and arid? Is it related to habitat loss or drying? Surprised music was not one of the losses. Yes, that's a good question. They didn't have good soil moisture data, so it was fairly rough categorizations, and they kind of regretted they hadn't been taking soil moisture data over that whole time period. But they do think it's due to drying in those particular habitats, but or at least in the wet fen. I don't know about the arid. So it's another one of these. It's a lot easier to present the pattern than it is to present the explanation for the pattern. Is there any predator parasite control on dog ticks in their established range? I think, well, yeah, yeah, I don't know too much about dog ticks in their established range. I've heard that possum are really great predators of ticks in general, but I could only, speculate on that. There is a really cool beetle in the rainforest in Central America that lives in the fur of arboreal mice. And people were mystified because this beetle was huge. And if you put this beetle on a mouse from North America, the mouse immediately got the beetle off. It was like, what is this beetle doing on me? But in Central America and South America, the mice are perfectly fine letting like 2 or 3 of these beetles live in their fur. And if you look inside the guts of the beetles, you find mouse blood. So that was a mystery. The answer came when they discovered that those beetles feed on ticks and fleas and lice and keep the mice ectoparasite free. There's a mutualism. So, but I don't think most people would want to have a beetle living in the fur of their dog. So or dogs probably wouldn't even stand it either. I realize it's not the focus, but can you speak to specific implications for gardening, particularly pollination Southeast? Yeah, Kitty could help with that a lot for Southeast. Yeah. Implications for gardening as related to climate change. Yeah, I can't speak too knowledgeably about that. Other than hardiness zones are moving, you know, we know that the growing season is lengthening, and so you may be able to grow things you wouldn't be able to grow before. But if I don't know.
I think the main concern sometimes people have is that there's not enough pollinators in the East. And that's not anything I've really noticed. I usually see a lot of pollinators, but maybe the question is if we do suffer these declines, or I don't know,
right,
northward migrations, and without the filling in northward migrations, maybe there'd be a problem.
right. Let's see.
Insect guide.
Oh, good field guide. The insects of Southeast Alaska doesn't have a good field guide, unfortunately. Some of the species that are in the South Central field guide that Dominique Collette wrote do occur in the Southeast. So I'd definitely recommend Dominique's guide if that's still available. That's the only sort of general field guide that we have to all of Alaskan, well, to all groups of Alaskan insects. The field guides of Armstrong and Hudson looking at dragonflies are awesome, and that applies to Southeast. The butterflies applies to Southeast, the butterfly guide, and the aquatic insect guide that Bob Armstrong and Hudson put together as well is relevant. So those are available, and Bob's stuff you can find online pretty easily. And I think Bob is actually in the audience, so he might even be able to talk about those. Let's see, for the Juneau butterfly question, here's the species that has been reported in Southeast Alaska on iNaturalist. Cool. So hopefully the person asking about butterflies can check out that link. And the moose might like the tick beetle. Yeah, right. Oh, could put that. I guess one problem, of course, is that beetle that lives on mice in Central America might find the north a little too cold. Yeah. Well, great questions, everybody. Yeah, and thanks for sticking with it. Me a little late here on Friday night. If there are any other questions, I'd be happy to take them, or
just remind me the name of the beetle with that kind of rainbow edge, because I swear I collected one north of the Brooks Range.
Yeah, well, it's called the rainbow beetle,
Yeah.
common parlance, but it's Carabus wiedinghoffii.
Okay.
And yeah, and if you think you collected one?
Yeah, and I think I sent it to you.
Oh,
we'll talk about that later.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll find it.
Yeah, let's hope so. Was the introduced butterfly in Fairbanks thought to have been brought in by humans, or did it move on its own? Great question, Matt. It almost certainly wasn't brought in by people. It first appeared in, far outside of town in the long-term research site, actually. One of the sites that Ken Phillip frequented quite regularly, but it was actually his collaborator, Jim Cruz, who worked with the Forest Service, who picked up the first specimens. And that was quite a shock to Ken, who had, this was 2002, and Ken had been collecting butterflies intensively in Fairbanks since the late 60s. And for someone else to find a species of butterfly practically in his backyard that he'd never seen before was really shocking. But yeah, we think, so that species does do what some butterflies do on certain years. They'll have a big eruption northward. And most of those, and I think the red admiral is one of these species that does that. They are sighted during the summer, but then they die off in the winter, and you don't see them again for years or whatever. But in this case, the Compton tortoiseshell managed to during one of its big eruptions, it managed to hold on and get a population going that survived over winter. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much, Derek, and thanks to everyone who attended. I think there's another talk next Friday. Is that correct, Kenny?
Yes, the next one, I should know it in my head, but I do not.
It's okay.
You just go to uas.alaska.edu/Egan lecture. Our full schedule's there with the registration links, and you can see if there's something else that might be of interest to you, and you can register at any time.
Great. Well, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks so much, Derek. Thanks, everybody. And I believe there's a recording of the talk that will be available in probably about a week or so.
Yep.
I think it takes.
Yes, so that's the plan.
And yeah, if anyone comes up with any, I would suggest people who are interested in insects join, and they're on Facebook, join that Facebook Bugs and Plants of Alaska group.
Yeah, it's a great group. My wife is one of the administrators, so and I get to help with a lot of IDs.
It's pretty fun.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you, Derek.
All right. Well, I'm going to leave. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Great
Have
weekend.
a good evening.
Bye.
And yes, I'll send you a picture of my beetle.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.